This is a continuation of The Star Stealers by Edmond Hamilton, comprising parts 4 through 6, and the end. Part 4. Faint light was filtering through my eyelids when I came back to consciousness. As I opened them, I sat weakly up, then fell back. Dazedly, I gazed about me. I was lying in a small square room lit only by its own glowing walls and floor and ceiling, a room whose one side slanted steeply upward and inward, pierced by a small barred window that was the only opening. Opposite me I discerned a low door of metal bars, or grating, beyond which lay a long, glowing walled corridor. Then, all these things were suddenly blotted out by the anxious face of Horace Hull, bending down toward me. "You're awake!" he exclaimed, his face alight. "You know me, Ranrarak?" For answer I struggled again to a sitting position, aided by the arm of Dalnara, who had appeared beside me. I felt strangely weak, exhausted, my head throbbing with racing fires. "Where are we?" I asked at last. "The fight in the city. I remember that. But where are we now? And where's Nal Jack?" The eyes of my two friends met and glanced away, while I looked anxiously toward them. Then Horace Hull spoke slowly. "We are imprisoned in this little room in one of the great pyramids of the glowing city," he said. "And in this room you have lain for weeks, Ranrarak." "Weeks?" I gasped, and he nodded. "It's been almost 10 weeks since we were captured there in the city outside," he said. "And for all that time you've lain here out of your head from that blow you received, sometimes delirious and raving, sometimes completely unconscious. And in all that time this dark star, this world, has been plunging on through space toward our galaxy, and our sun, and the theft and doom of that sun. 10 more days, and it passes our sun, stealing it from the galaxy. And I, who have learned at last what forces are behind it all, lie prisoned here. It was after we 4 were brought to this cell, after our capture, that I was summoned before our captors, before a council of those strange tentacle creatures which was made up, I think, of their own scientists. They examined me, my clothing, all about me, then sought to communicate with me. They do not speak, communicating with each other by telepathy, but they strove to enter into communication with me by a projection of pictures on a smooth wall, pictures of their dark star world, pictures of our own galaxy, our own sun, picture after picture, until at last I began to understand the drift of them, the history and the purpose of these strange beings and their stranger world. For ages, I learned, for countless eons, their mighty sun had flashed through the infinities of space, alone except for its numerous planets upon which had risen these races of tentacle creatures. Their sun was flaming with life then, and on their circling planets they had attained to immense science, immense power, as their system rolled on, a single wandering star, through the depths of uncharted space. But as the slow eons passed, the mighty sun began to cool, and their planets to grow colder and colder. At last it had cooled so far that to revive its dying fires, they dislodged one of their own planets from its orbit and sent it crashing into their sun, feeding its waning flames. And when more centuries had passed and it was again cooling, they followed the same course, sending another planet into it, and so on through the ages, staving off the death of their sun by sacrificing their worlds, until at last but one planet was left to them. And still their sun was cooling, darkening, dying. For further ages, though, they managed to preserve a precarious existence on their single planet by means of artificial heat production, until at last their great sun had cooled and solidified to such a point that life was possible upon its dark, dead surface. That surface, because of the solidified radioactive elements in it, shone always with pale light, and to it the races of the tentacle creatures now moved. By means of great air current projectors, they transferred the atmosphere of their planet to the dark star itself, and then cast loose their planet to wander off into space by itself, for its orbit had become erratic, and they feared that it would crash into their own great dark star world, about which it had revolved. But on the warm, shining surface of the great dark star they now spread out and multiplied, raising their cities from its glowing rock and clinging to its surface as it hurtled on and on and on through the dark infinities of trackless space. But at last, after further ages of such existence, the tentacle races saw that again they were menaced with extinction, since in obedience to the inexorable laws of nature, their dark star was cooling still further, the molten fires at its center which warmed its surface gradually dying down, while that surface became colder and colder. In a little while, they knew, the fires at its center would be completely dead, and their great world would be a bitter, frozen waste, unless they devised some plan by which to keep warm its surface. At this moment their astronomers came forward with the announcement that their dark star world, plunging on through empty space, would soon pass a great star cluster, or galaxy of suns at a distance of some 15 billion miles. They could not invade the worlds of this galaxy, they knew, for they had discovered that upon those worlds lived countless trillions of intelligent inhabitants, who would be able to repel their own invasion, if they attempted it. There was but one expedient left, therefore, and that was to attempt to jerk a sun out of this galaxy as they passed by it, to steal a star from it to take out with them into space, which would revolve around their own mighty dark world and supply it with the heat they needed. The sun which they fixed on to steal was one at the galaxy's very edge, our own sun. If they passed this at 15 billion miles, as their course then would cause them to do, they could do nothing. But if they could change their dark star's course, could curve inward to pass this sun at some 3 billion miles instead of 15, then the powerful gravitational grip of their own gigantic world would grasp this sun and carry it out with it into space. The sun's planets, too, would be carried out. But these they planned to crash into the fires of the sun itself to increase its size and splendor. All that was needed, therefore, was some method of curving their world's course inward, and for this they had recourse to the great gravity condensers which they had already used to shift their own planets. You know that it is gravitational force alone which keeps the suns and planets to their courses, and you know that the gravitational force of any body, sun or planet, is radiated out from it in all directions, tending to pull all things toward that body. In the same way there is radiated outward perpetually from the galaxy the combined attractive gravitational force of all its swarming suns, and a tiny fraction of this outward radiating force, of course, struck the dark star, pulling it weakly toward the galaxy. If more of that outward radiating force could strike the dark star, it would be pulled toward the galaxy with more power, would be pulled nearer toward the galaxy's edge as it passed. It was just that which their gravity condenser accomplished. In a low pit at the heart of one of their cities, this city, in fact, they placed the condenser, a mass of brilliant hemispherical ray attractors, which caused more of the galaxy's outward shooting attractive force to fall upon the dark star, which condensed and concentrated that radiating force upon the dark star, thereby pulling the dark star inward toward the galaxy's edge in a great curve. When they reached a distance of 3 billion miles from the galaxy's edge, they planned to turn off the great condenser, and their dark star would then shoot past the galaxy's edge, jerking out our sun with it from that edge, by its own terrific gravitational grip. If the condenser were turned off before they came that close, however, they would pass the sun at a distance too far to pull it out with them, and would then speed on out into space alone, toward the freezing of their world and their own extinction. For that reason, the condenser and the great cage switch of the condenser were guarded always by hovering cones, to prevent its being turned off before the right moment. Since then, they have kept the great gravity condenser in unceasing operation, and their dark star has swept in toward the galaxy's edge in a great curve. Back in our own solar system I saw and understood what would be the result of that inward curve, and so we came here, and were captured. And in those weeks since we were captured, while you have lain here unconscious and raving, this dark star has been plunging nearer and nearer toward our galaxy and toward our sun. 10 more days and it passes that sun, carrying it out with it into the darkness of boundless space, unless the great condenser is turned off before then. 10 more days, and we lie here, powerless to warn any of what forces work toward the doom of our sun. There was a long silence when Horace Hull's voice had ceased, a whispering, brain-crushing silence, which I broke at last with a single question. "But Naljak?" I asked, and the faces of my two companions became suddenly strange, while Dalnara turned away. At last Horace Hull spoke. "It was after the tentacle scientists had examined me," he said gently, "that they brought Naljak down to examine. I think that they spared me for the time being because of my apparently greater knowledge. but Naljak they, vivisected. There was a longer hush than before, one in which the brave, quiet figure of the wheelman, a companion in all my service with the fleet, seemed to rise before my suddenly blurring eyes. Then abruptly I swung down from the narrow bunk on which I lay, clutched dizzily at my companions for support, and walked unsteadily to the square, barred little window. Outside and beneath me lay the city of the Dark Star people, a mighty mass of pyramidal, glowing buildings, streets thronged with their dark, gliding figures, above them the swarms of the racing cones. From our little window, the glowing wall of the Great Pyramid which held us slanted steeply down for fully 500 feet, and upward above us for twice that distance. And as I raised my eyes upward, I saw, clear and bright above, a great far-flung field of stars, the stars of our own galaxy toward which this world was plunging. And burning out clearest among these the star that was nearest of all, the shining yellow star that was our own sun. I think now that it was the sight of that yellow star, largening steadily as our dark star swept on toward it, which filled us with such utter despair in the hours, the days, that followed. Out beyond the city, our cruiser lay hidden in the black forest, we knew, and could we escape we might yet carry word back to the Federation of what was at hand, but escape was impossible. And so, through the long days, days measurable only by our own time dials, we waxed deeper into an apathy of dull despair. Rapidly my strength came back to me, though the strange food supplied us once a day by our captors was almost uneatable. But as the days fled by, my spirits sank lower and lower, and less we spoke to each other as the doom of our sun approached, the only change in anything around us being the moment each 24 hours when the signal horns called across the city, summoning the hordes in its streets to their 4-hour sleep period. At last, though, we woke suddenly to realization of the fact that 9 days had passed since my awakening, and that upon the next day the dark star would be plunging past the burning yellow star above us and jerking it into its grip. Then, at last, all our apathy dropped from us, and we raged against the walls of our cells with insensate fury. And then, with startling abruptness, came the means of our deliverance. For hours there had been a busy clanging of tools and machines somewhere in the great building above us, and numbers of the tentacle creatures had been passing our barred door carrying tools and instruments towards some work being carried out overhead. We had come to pay but little attention to them, in time, but as one passed, there came a sudden rattle and clang from outside, and turning to the door, we saw that one of the passing creatures had dropped a thick coil of slender metal chain upon the floor, and had passed on without noticing his loss. In an instant, we were at the door and reaching through its bars toward the coil. But though we each strained our arms and turned toward it, the thing lay a few tantalizing inches beyond our grasp. A moment we surveyed it, baffled, fearing the return at any moment of the creature who had dropped it, and then Dalnara, with a sudden inspiration, lay flat upon the floor, thrusting her leg out through the grating. In a moment, she had caught the coil with her foot, and in another moment we had it inside, examining it. We found that though it was as slender as my smallest finger, the chain was of incredible strength, and when we roughly estimated the extent of its thick coiled length, we discovered that it would be more than long enough to reach from our window to the street below. At once, therefore, we secreted the thing in a corner of the room and impatiently awaited the sleep period when we could work without fear of interruption. At last, after what seemed measureless hours of waiting, the great horns blared forth across the city outside, and swiftly its streets emptied, the sounds in our building quieting until all was silence, except for the humming of a few watchful cones above the great condenser, and the deep droning of the condenser itself in the distance. At once we set to work at the bars of our window. Frantically we chipped at the rock at the base of one of the metal bars, using the few odd bits of metal at our command, but at the end of 2 hours had done no more than scratch away a bare inch of the glowing stone. Another hour, and we had laid bare from the rock the lower end of the bar. But now we knew that within minutes the sleep period of the city outside would be ending, and into its streets would be swarming its gliding throngs, making impossible all attempts at escape. Furiously we worked, dripping now with sweat, until at last, when our time dials showed that less than half an hour remained to us, I gave over the chipping at the rock, and wrapped our chain firmly around the lower end of the bar we had loosened. Then stepping back into the cell and bracing ourselves against the wall below the window, we pulled backward with all our strength. A tense moment we strained thus, the thick bar holding fast, and then abruptly it gave and fell from its socket in the wall to the floor. With a loud ringing clang, we lay in a heap on the floor, panting and listening for any sound of alarm, then rose and swiftly fastened the chain's end to one of the remaining bars. The chain itself we dropped out of the window, watching it uncoil its length down the mighty building's glowing side until its end trailed on the empty glowing street far below. At once I motioned Horace Hull to the window, and in a moment he had squeezed through its bars and was sliding slowly down the chain, hand under hand. Before he was 10 feet down, Dalnara was out and creeping downward likewise, and then I too squeezed through the window and followed them downward, the three of us crawling down the chain along the huge building's steeply sloping side like 3 flies. I was 10 feet down from the window now, 20 feet, and glanced down toward the glowing, empty street, 500 feet below, and seeming 5,000. Then, at a sudden sound from above me, I looked sharply up, and as I did so, the most sickening sensation of fear I had ever experienced swept over me. For at the window we had just left, 20 feet above me, one of the tentacle creatures was leaning out, brought to our cell, I doubted not, by the metal bar's ringing fall, his white, red-rimmed eye turned full upon me. I heard sighs of horror from my 2 companions beneath me, and for a single moment we hung motionless along the chain's length, swinging along the huge pyramid's glowing side at a height of hundreds of feet above the shining streets below. Then the creature raised one of its tentacles, a metal tool in its grasp, which he brought down in a sharp blow on the chain at the window's edge. Again, he repeated the blow, and again. He was cutting the chain. Part 5. For a space of seconds I hung motionless there, and then as the tool in the grasp of the creature above came down on the chain in another sharp blow, the sound galvanized me into sudden action. "Slide on down!" I cried. They didn't, however, but followed me up the chain, though Dalnara and I alone came to grips with the horrible Dead Star creature. I gripped the links with frantic hands, pulling myself upward toward the window, and the creature at the window, 20 feet above me. 3 times the tool in his hand came down upon the chain while I struggled up toward him, and each time I expected the strand to sever and send us down to death. But the hard metal withstood the blows for the moment, and before he could strike at it again I was up to the level of the window and reaching up toward him. As I did so, swift black tentacles thrust out and gripped Dalnara and me, while another of the snaky arms swept up with the tool in its grasp for a blow on my head. Before it could fall, though, I had reached out with my right hand, holding to the chain with my left, and had grasped the body of the thing inside the window, pulling him outside before he had time to resist. As I did so, my own hold slipped a little, so that we hung a few feet below the window, both clinging to the slender chain and both striking futilely at each other, he with the metal tool and I with my clenched fist. A moment we hung there, swaying hundreds of feet above the luminous stone street, and then the creature's tentacles coiled swiftly around my neck, tightening, choking me. Hanging precariously to our slender strand with one hand, I struck out blindly with the other, but felt consciousness leaving me as that remorseless grip tightened. Then, with a last effort, I gripped the chain firmly with both hands, doubled my feet under me, and kicked out with all my strength. The kick caught the cone body of my opponent squarely, tearing him loose from his own hold on the chain, and then there was a sudden wrench at my neck and I was free of him, while beneath Dalnara and I glimpsed his dark body whirling down toward the street below, twisting and turning in its fall along the building's slanting side, and then crashing finally down upon the smooth, shining street below, where it lay a black, little huddled mass. Hanging there, I looked down, panting, and saw that Horace Hull had reached the chain's bottom and was standing in the empty street, awaiting us. Glancing up, I saw that the blows of the creature I had fought had half severed one of the links above me, but there was no time to readjust it. So with a prayer that it might hold a few moments longer, Dalnara and I began our slipping, sliding progress downward. The sharp links tore our hands cruelly as we slid downward, and once it seemed to me that the chain gave a little beneath our weight. Apprehensively I looked upward, then down to where Horace Hull was waving encouragement. Down, down we slid, not daring to look beneath again, not knowing how near we might be to the bottom. Then there was another slight give in the chain, a sudden grating catch, and abruptly the weakened link above snapped and we dropped headlong downward, 10 feet into the arms of Horace Hole. A moment we sprawled in a little heap there on the glowing street, and then staggered to our feet. "Out of the city!" cried Horace Hall. "We could never get to the condenser switch on foot, but in the cruiser there's a chance. And we have but a few minutes now before the sleep period ends." Down the broad street we ran now, through squares and avenues of glowing mighty pyramids, crouching down once as the ever-hovering cones swept by above, and then racing on. At any moment, I knew, the great horns might blare across the city, bringing its swarming thousands into its streets, and our only chance was to win free of it before that happened. At last, we were speeding down the street by which we had entered the city, and before us lay that street's end, with beyond it the vista of black forest and glowing plain over which we had come. And now we were racing over that glowing plain, a quarter mile, a half, a mile. Abruptly from far behind came the calling, crescendo notes of the mighty horns, marking the sleep period's end, bringing back into the streets the city's tentacle people. It could be but moments now, we knew, before our escape was discovered, and as we panted on at our highest speed, we listened for the sounding of the alarm behind us. It came. When we had drawn to within a half-mile of the black forest, where our cruiser lay hidden, another great tumult of horn notes burst out over the glowing city behind, high and shrill and raging. And glancing back, we saw swarms of the black cones rising from the pyramidal building's summits, circling, searching, speeding out over the glowing plains around the city, a compact mass of them racing straight toward us. "On!" cried Horace Hall. "It's our last chance to get to the cruiser!" Staggering, stumbling, with the last of our strength we sped on, over the glowing soil and rocks, toward the rim of the black forest which lay now a scant quarter-mile ahead. Then, suddenly, Horace Hall stumbled, tripped, and fell. I halted, turned toward him, then turned again as Dalnara shouted thickly and pointed upward. We had been sighted by the speeding cones above, and 2 of them were driving straight down toward us. A moment we stood there, rigid, while the great cones dipped toward us, waiting for the death that would crash down upon us from them. Then suddenly, a great dark shape loomed in the air above and behind us, from which sprang out swift shafts of brilliant green light, the dazzling decohesion ray, striking the 2 swooping cones and sending them down in twin torrents of shattered wreckage. And now the mighty bulk behind us swept swiftly down upon us, and we saw that it was our cruiser. Smoothly it shot down to the ground, and we stumbled to its side, through the waiting open door. As I staggered up to the bridge room, the 3rd officer was shouting in my ear. "We sighted you from the forest," he was crying. "Came out in the cruiser to get you—" But now I was in the bridge room, brushing the wheelman from the controls, sending our ship slanting sharply up toward the zenith. Horace Hall was at my side now, pointing toward the great telechart and shouting something in my ear. I glanced over, and my heart stood still. For the great dark disk on the chart had swept down to within an inch of the shining line around our sun circle, the danger line. "The condenser!" I shouted. "We must get to that switch. Turn it off. It's our only chance." We were racing through the air toward the luminous city now, and ahead a mighty swarm of the cones was gathering and forming to meet us, while from behind and from each side came other swarms, driving on toward us. Then the door clicked open and Dalnara burst into the bridge room. "The ship's ray tubes are useless," she cried. "They've used the last charge in the ray tanks." At that cry the controls quivered under my hands. The ship slowed, stopped. Silence filled the bridge room, filled all the cruiser, the last silence of despair. We had failed. Weaponless our ship hung there, motionless, while toward it from all directions leaped the swift and swarming cones, in dozens, in scores, in hundreds, leaping toward us, long black messengers of death, while on the great telechart, the mighty dark star leapt closer toward the shining circle that was our sun, toward the fateful line around it. We had failed, and death was upon us. And now the black swarms of the cones were very near us, and were slowing a little, as though fearing some ruse on our part, were slowing but moving closer. Closer, while we awaited them in a last utter stupor of despair. Closer they came. Closer. Closer. A ringing, exultant cry suddenly sounded from somewhere in the cruiser beneath me, taken up by a sudden babel of voices, and then Dalnara cried out hoarsely, beside me, and pointed up through our upper observation windows toward a long, shining, slender shape that was driving down toward us out of the upper air, while behind it drove a vast swarm of other and larger shapes, long and black and mighty. "It's our own ship!" Dalnara was shouting insanely. "It's Ship 16! They escaped, got back to the galaxy, and look there, behind them! It's the fleet, the Federation fleet!" There was a wild singing of blood in my ears as I looked up, saw the mighty swarm of black shapes that were speeding down upon us behind the shining cruiser, the 5,000 mighty battle cruisers of the Federation fleet. The fleet. The massed fighting ships of the galaxy, cruisers from Antares and Sirius and Regulus and Spica, the keepers of the Milky Way Patrol, the picked fighters of a universe. Ships with which I had cruised from Arcturus to Deneb, beside which I had battled in many an interstellar fight. The fleet. They were straightening, wheeling, hovering, high above us, and then they were driving down upon the massed swarms of cones around us in one titanic, simultaneous swoop. Then around us the air flashed brilliant with green ray and bursting flares, as decohesion rays and etheric bombs crashed and burst from ship to ship. Weaponless our cruiser hung there, at the center of that gigantic battle, while around us the mighty cruisers of the galaxy and the long black cones of the tentacle people crashed and whirled and flared, swooping and dipping and racing upon each other, whirling down to the glowing world below in scores of shattered wrecks, vanishing in silent flares of blinding light. From far away across the surface of the luminous world beneath, the great swarms of cones drove on toward the battle, from the shining towers of cities far away, racing fearlessly to the attack, sinking and falling and crumbling beneath the terrible rays of the leaping ships above, ramming and crashing with them to the ground in sacrificial plunges. But swiftly now, the cones were vanishing beneath the brilliant rays. Then Horace Hall was at my side, shouting and pointing down toward the glowing city below. "The condenser!" he cried, pointing to where its blue radiance still flared on. "The dark star, look!" He flung a hand toward the telechart, where the dark star disk was but a scant half-inch from the shining line around our sun circle, a tiny gap that was swiftly closing. I glanced toward the battle that raged around us, where the Federation cruisers were sending the cones down to destruction by swarms. Now, but unheeding of the condenser below. A bare half-mile beneath us lay that condenser, and its cage pillar switch, which a single shaft of the green ray would have destroyed instantly, and our ray tubes were useless. Then wild resolve flared up in my brain, and I slammed down the levers in my hands, sent our ship racing down toward the condenser and its upheld cage, like a released thunderbolt of hurtling metal. "Hold tight!" I screamed as we thundered down. "I'm going to ram the switch!" And now, up toward us, were rushing the brilliant blue hemispheres of the pit, the great pillar and upheld cage beside them, toward which we flashed with the speed of lightning. Crash! And a tremendous shock shook the cruiser from stem to stern as its prow tore through the upheld metal cage, ripping it from its supporting pillar and sending it crashing to the ground. Our cruiser spun, hovered for a moment as though to whirl down to destruction, then steadied, while we at the window gazed downward, shouting. For beneath us the blinding radiance of the massed hemispheres had suddenly snapped out. Around and above us the great battle had died, the last of the cones tumbling to the ground beneath the rays of the mighty fleet, and now we turned swiftly to the telechart. Tensely we scanned it. Upon it, the great dark star disk was creeping still toward the line around our sun circle, creeping slower and slower toward it, but still moving on. 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 Had we lost, at the last moment? Now the black disk, hardly moving, was all but touching the shining line, separated from it by only a hair's breadth gap. A single moment we watched while it hovered thus, a moment in which was settled the destiny of a sun. And then a babble of incoherent cries came from our lips, for the tiny gap was widening. The black disk was moving back, was curving outward again from our sun and from the galaxy's edge, curving out once more into the blank depths of space whence it had come, without the star it had planned to steal. Out, out, out. And we knew at last that we had won. and the mighty fleet of ships around us knew, from their own telecharts. They were massing around us and hanging motionless, while beneath us the palely glowing gigantic dark star swept on, out into the darkness of trackless space until it hung like a titanic feeble moon in the heavens before us, retreating farther and farther from the shining stars of our galaxy, carrying with it the glowing cities and the hordes of the tentacle peoples, never to return. There in the bridge room, with our massed ships around us, we three watched it go, then turned back toward our own yellow star, serene and far and benignant, that yellow star around which swung our own 8 little worlds. And then Dalnara flung out a hand toward it, half weeping now. "The sun!" she cried. "The sun! The good old sun that we fought for and saved, our sun till the end of time." Part 6. It was on a night a week later that Dalnara and I said farewell to Horus Hol, standing on the roof of that same great building on Neptune from which we had started with our 50 cruisers weeks before. We had learned in that week how the only survivor of those cruisers, Ship 16, had managed to shake off the pursuing cones in that first fierce attack and had sped back to the galaxy to give the alarm, of how the mighty Federation fleet had raced through the galaxy from beyond Antares in answer to that alarm, speeding out toward the approaching dark star and reaching it just in time to save our own ship and our sun. The other events of that week, the honors which had been loaded upon us, I shall not attempt to describe. There was little in the solar system which we three could not have had for the asking, but Horus Hol was content to follow the science that was his life work, while Dalnara, after the manner of her sex through all the ages, sought a beauty parlor, and I asked only to continue with our cruiser in the service of the Federation fleet. The solar system was home to us, would always be home to us, but never, I knew, would either of us be able to break away from the fascination of the great fleet's interstellar patrol, the flashing from sun to sun, the long silent hours in cosmic night and stellar glare. We would be star rovers, she and I, until the end. So now, ready to rejoin the fleet, I stood on the great building's roof, the mighty black bulk of our cruiser behind us, and the stupendous canopy of the galaxy's glittering suns over our heads. In the streets below, too, were other lights, brilliant flares, where thronging crowds still celebrated the escape of their worlds. And now Horus Hol was speaking, more moved than ever I had seen him. "If Naljak were here," he said, and we were all silent for a moment. Then his hand came out toward us, and silently we wrung it, turning toward the cruiser's door. As it slammed shut behind us, we were ascending to the bridge room, and from there we glimpsed now the great roof dropping away beneath us as we slanted up from it once more, the dark figure of Horus Hol outlined for a moment at its edge against the lights below, then vanishing. And the world beneath us was shrinking, vanishing once more, until at last of all the solar system behind us, there was visible only the single yellow spark that was our sun. Then about our outward racing cruiser was darkness, the infinite void's eternal night. Night and the unchanging, glittering hosts of wheeling, flaming stars. The end. Best Audiobooks for Free hopes that you have enjoyed this production of The Star Stealers by Edmond Hamilton. Please subscribe to our channel on YouTube and Rumble, as your subscription is the support we need to create more great, free content. Please look to our website at bestaudiobooksforfree.com for a complete list of our audiobooks.